The rain hammered against the windows of Murphy's bar as Sarah Chen pushed through the heavy wooden door. Her civilian clothes were soaked, and her dark hair stuck to her face. She had been driving for 6 hours straight, trying to reach her hometown before her father's funeral tomorrow. The small coastal town of Millbrook looked exactly the same as when she left 8 years ago. Sarah walked to the bar counter, water dripping from her jacket onto the worn wooden floor. The bartender, an older man with graying hair, looked up from cleaning glasses. "What can I get you?" he asked with a friendly smile. "Just a coffee, please." "Black?" Sarah replied, pulling out a $20 bill from her wallet. She noticed a few locals sitting at corner tables, their conversations quiet and peaceful. The warm atmosphere was exactly what she needed after the long, emotional drive. As she waited for her coffee, Sarah thought about her father. He had been a retired Marine, and she knew he would have been proud of what she had accomplished. She had made it through the toughest military training in the world, becoming one of the few women to earn the Navy SEAL Trident. But tonight she was just a daughter coming home to say goodbye to her dad. The door burst open with a loud bang, making everyone in the bar turn around. 3 men in military uniforms walked in, shaking rain from their coats. They were clearly from the nearby naval base, probably officers based on their confident walk and pressed uniforms. The tallest one, a lieutenant with sharp features and cold blue eyes, scanned the room like he owned it. 3 beers. The lieutenant called out to the bartender without even sitting down. His voice was loud and demanding. His 2 companions, both younger sailors, followed him to a table near where Sarah sat at the bar. Sarah tried to ignore them and focus on her coffee, but their conversation grew louder with each sip of beer. They were talking about training exercises, complaining about their commanding officers, and making jokes that became increasingly inappropriate. "This town is dead," the lieutenant said, his voice carrying across the quiet bar. "Nothing but old fishermen and their boring wives. Not a decent woman in sight." The bartender shot them a warning look, but the lieutenant either didn't notice or didn't care. Sarah felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her eyes on her coffee cup. She had learned long ago that sometimes the best response was no response at all. "Hey, beautiful," the lieutenant suddenly called out. Sarah realized he was talking to her. "Why don't you come join us? We could use some company from someone who actually looks interesting." Sarah slowly turned around on her bar stool. "No, thank you," she said politely but firmly. "I'm just here for coffee." The lieutenant's friends laughed, and one of them whispered something that made the lieutenant's face redden. He stood up from his table and walked over to where Sarah sat. "Come on, don't be like that," he said, moving closer than was comfortable. "I'm Lieutenant Mark Davidson. I run training operations at the base. You should feel honored that I'm talking to you." Sarah could smell the alcohol on his breath. She turned back to her coffee, hoping he would take the hint and leave her alone. "I'm not interested in conversation right now," she said calmly. "Not interested?" Lieutenant Davidson laughed loudly. "Do you know who I am?" "I'm an officer in the United States Navy. I've trained hundreds of sailors. I could buy and sell this whole pathetic town." The other customers in the bar were now staring, clearly uncomfortable with the scene developing. The bartender stepped forward, but Lieutenant Davidson waved him away. "Sir, maybe you should rejoin your friends," the bartender suggested gently. "Maybe you should mind your own business," Davidson snapped back. He turned his attention back to Sarah. "I don't like being ignored, especially by some small-town girl who probably doesn't even have a real job." Sarah felt her patience wearing thin, but she had been in situations like this before. During her SEAL training, she had learned to control her emotions and think strategically. Getting into a fight with a drunk officer in her hometown the night before her father's funeral was not what she needed. "I asked you politely to leave me alone," Sarah said, still facing forward. "Please respect that." Lieutenant Davidson moved even closer, his face now just inches from her ear. "Or what? What are you going to do about it? Call your boyfriend? Call the police? Do you think anyone in this town would believe you over a Navy officer?" That was when Sarah stood up from her bar stool. She was shorter than Davidson, but there was something in her posture that made him take a small step back. Her movements were fluid and controlled, like a coiled spring ready to release. "I'm asking you one more time to leave me alone," she said, her voice quiet but carrying a steel edge that cut through the bar's atmosphere. Davidson's friends were now watching nervously. Something about Sarah's demeanor had changed completely. She no longer looked like just another civilian woman having coffee. There was a dangerous stillness about her that made the entire bar go quiet. But Lieutenant Davidson was too drunk and too arrogant to notice the warning signs. Instead of backing down, he made the biggest mistake of his military career. He reached out and grabbed Sarah's arm roughly. "Listen here, you little—" He never finished his sentence. In one swift movement, Sarah twisted out of his grip, spun around, and delivered a precise strike to his solar plexus that doubled him over. Before he could react, she had him in a submission hold that left him gasping for air and completely helpless. The entire bar fell silent except for Davidson's labored breathing. His two companions started to move forward, but one look from Sarah made them freeze in place. She held Lieutenant Davidson in the hold for exactly 5 seconds, then released him. He stumbled backward, clutching his chest and staring at her in complete shock. "What the hell are you?" he wheezed, his face red with embarrassment and lack of oxygen. Sarah straightened her jacket and calmly returned to her coffee as if nothing had happened. The entire encounter had lasted less than 10 seconds, but it had completely changed the atmosphere in Murphy's bar. Lieutenant Davidson stood there, still trying to catch his breath, his face cycling between confusion and rage. His two companions looked like they wanted to disappear into the wooden floor. The other bar patrons watched in stunned silence, unsure of what they had just witnessed. "You're going to regret that," Davidson wheezed, pointing a shaking finger at Sarah. "Do you have any idea what you just did? You assaulted a military officer. I can have you arrested. I can make your life a living hell." Sarah took another sip of her coffee, completely calm. "I defended myself after you grabbed me," she said without turning around. "Everyone here saw you put your hands on me first." The bartender nodded quickly. "She's right, Lieutenant. You did grab her arm. I saw it myself." Davidson's face grew redder. He wasn't used to being contradicted, especially not by civilians. At the naval base, his word was law. Junior officers feared him, and enlisted sailors scrambled to follow his orders. But here in this small-town bar, his rank meant nothing against what had just happened. "I barely touched you," he said, his voice getting louder. "What you did was completely out of proportion. No normal woman moves like that. What are you, some kind of martial arts freak?" Sarah finally turned around on her bar stool to face him directly. "I'm someone who doesn't like being grabbed by strangers in bars," she said simply. One of Davidson's companions, a young sailor with nervous eyes, tugged at his sleeve. "Sir, maybe we should just go. This isn't worth the trouble." "Shut up, Petty Officer Martinez," Davidson snapped. "I'm not leaving until I get some answers." And an apology. Sarah almost smiled at that. During her SEAL training, she had faced down instructors who were far more intimidating than this arrogant lieutenant. She had been screamed at by drill sergeants, pushed to her physical and mental limits, and tested in ways that would break most people. A drunk officer in a bar was barely a minor inconvenience. "You want answers?" Sarah asked, standing up again. This time, Davidson automatically took 2 steps backward. "Here's an answer. You came into this peaceful bar, disrupted everyone's evening, spoke disrespectfully about this town and its people, refused to take no for an answer when I asked to be left alone, and then you put your hands on me. In my experience, that makes you the problem here, not me." The bartender was nodding along with every word. Several of the local customers were also showing signs of agreement. Davidson was beginning to realize that the room was turning against him. "My experience?" Davidson seized on those words. "What experience? What's your background? You move like military, but there's no way you're military. Women don't serve in combat roles that would teach moves like that." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you think?" "I know that," Davidson said confidently. "I've been in the Navy for 12 years. I know exactly what training produces what skills, and I'm telling you that what you just did isn't something they teach in basic self-defense classes." The second sailor, a young man with red hair and freckles, whispered urgently to Davidson, "Sir, maybe we should just apologize and leave. This is getting out of hand." "Seaman Rodriguez is right," the bartender added. "Lieutenant, you're welcome in my bar, but not if you're going to harass my customers. The lady asked you politely to leave her alone multiple times." Davidson ignored both of them. He was fixated on Sarah now, his military mind trying to solve the puzzle of how a civilian woman had so easily neutralized him. He prided himself on his tactical knowledge and his ability to read people. But Sarah didn't fit into any category he understood. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Davidson said, trying to regain some authority in his voice. "What's your background?" Where did you learn to fight like that? Sarah finished her coffee and placed the empty cup gently on the bar. I learned it from people who were better at it than you'll ever be, she said quietly. The insult hit Davidson like a physical blow. His entire identity was built around being a superior military professional. He had graduated from the Naval Academy, completed officer training, and worked his way up to a position where he trained other sailors. The idea that someone, especially a civilian woman, could dismiss his abilities so casually was unbearable. That's impossible, he said, his voice rising again. I know every combat training program in the military. I know what produces what results. There is no way you could have learned those moves without me knowing about it. Your knowledge has some gaps, Sarah replied. Davidson's companions were now actively trying to get him to leave. Petty Officer Martinez had his hand on Davidson's arm, and Seaman Rodriguez was practically begging him to walk away. But Davidson was too far gone in his anger and confusion to listen to reason. Prove it, he demanded. If you're so well trained, prove it. Tell me where you learned to fight. Tell me who your instructors were. Tell me what program you went through. Sarah looked around the bar. Every eye was on her. The locals were fascinated by this stranger who had so easily handled the arrogant officer. The bartender was clearly hoping the situation would resolve itself peacefully. And Davidson's own men were desperately trying to salvage what was left of their evening. Why would I need to prove anything to you? Sarah asked. You're the one who created this situation. You're the one who couldn't accept a simple no. You're the one who grabbed someone without permission. And now you want me to justify my response to your inappropriate behavior? Davidson's jaw worked as he struggled to find an answer. Everything Sarah said was logically correct, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it. He had built his entire career on being right, on being in control, on being the alpha male in every situation. Backing down now felt like admitting that everything he believed about himself was wrong. I think you're lying, he said finally. I think you got lucky with one move and now you're trying to act tough. I bet if we went outside right now you wouldn't be so confident. The bar went completely silent. Sarah looked at Davidson for a long moment, and something in her expression made him suddenly uncomfortable. It was the look of someone who had seen real combat, real danger, real violence. It was the look of someone who had been tested in ways that Davidson couldn't even imagine. You really don't want to take this outside with me, Sarah said quietly. The tension in Murphy's bar was thick enough to cut with a knife. Lieutenant Davidson stared at Sarah, his pride warring with the growing sense that he was in deeper water than he had realized. His two companions looked like they wanted to physically drag him out of the bar before things got worse. Are you threatening me? Davidson asked, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. I'm giving you advice, Sarah replied calmly. The same advice I've been giving you all evening. Walk away. Davidson's face flushed red again. In his 12 years of military service, he had never backed down from a confrontation. He had built his reputation on being tough, uncompromising, and always willing to escalate a situation to prove his point. The idea of walking away from a civilian woman was unthinkable. I don't take advice from civilians, he said, puffing out his chest. Especially not from someone who thinks one lucky move makes them some kind of fighter. Sarah sighed softly. She had hoped the situation could be resolved without further incident, but Davidson seemed determined to push things to their conclusion. She recognized the type. She had served with officers like him before. Men who confused aggression with leadership, who thought volume was the same as authority. Lieutenant Davidson, she said, using his name for the first time. You seem like someone who takes pride in military knowledge. Let me ask you a question. What do you know about naval special warfare? Davidson blinked, caught off guard by the change in topic. What does that have to do with anything? Just answer the question, Sarah said patiently. I know plenty, Davidson replied defensively. SEALs, Special Boat Teams EOD. I work with special operations personnel regularly. I coordinate training exercises with them. Good, Sarah nodded. Then you know what kind of training they go through. You know what they're capable of. Of course I do, Davidson said, though he was beginning to look uncertain about where this conversation was heading. Sarah reached into her jacket pocket, and every person in the bar tensed slightly. But instead of a weapon, she pulled out a simple black wallet. She opened it and extracted a military identification card which she placed on the bar counter. Take a look, she said simply. Davidson stepped forward, his curiosity overcoming his caution. He picked up the ID card and examined it closely. His face went through several expressions as he read the information. Confusion, disbelief, and then slowly dawning horror. The card read, Chen, Sarah M. Lieutenant Commander, United States Navy, Naval Special Warfare Command. Davidson's hands began to shake as he stared at the ID. He read it again, then looked up at Sarah, then back at the card. His mouth opened and closed several times without any sound coming out. That's not possible, he whispered. Why not? Sarah asked. Because you're... Davidson struggled to find words. You're a woman. Very observant, Sarah replied dryly. Petty Officer Martinez and Seaman Rodriguez crowded around to look at the ID card. When they saw what it said, their faces went pale. They both immediately straightened to attention, recognizing that they were in the presence of a superior officer. Ma'am, Martinez said quickly, we apologize for the lieutenant's behavior. We had no idea. At ease, Sarah said gently. You two aren't the problem here. Davidson was still staring at the ID card like it might suddenly change what it said. This has to be fake, he muttered. Women can't be Navy SEALs. It's not allowed. It wasn't allowed, Sarah corrected. Things change. Barriers fall. People adapt. Or at least some people do. The bartender leaned over to get a look at the ID card and his eyes widened. Several of the local customers had moved closer, sensing that something significant was happening. Word was spreading in whispers throughout the bar. You're really a Navy SEAL? The bartender asked in amazement. Naval Special Warfare Officer, Sarah confirmed. And Lieutenant Davidson here just spent the last 20 minutes explaining to me how women can't possibly have the training to do what I did to him. Davidson finally found his voice again, though it came out as a croak. There are no female SEALs. The program was open to women, but none of them made it through training. Sarah raised an eyebrow. None that you know of. The military would have publicized it, Davidson insisted, though he sounded less certain now. It would be huge news. They would want everyone to know that a woman finally made it through SEAL training. Would they? Sarah asked. Even if that woman was being assigned to classified operations? Even if revealing her identity could compromise ongoing missions? Even if protecting her anonymity was more important than good publicity? Davidson's face was now completely white. The implications of what Sarah was saying were sinking in. If she really was a Navy SEAL, then everything that had happened tonight took on a completely different meaning. He hadn't just harassed a civilian woman in a bar. He had harassed a superior officer. He had grabbed a superior officer. He had threatened a superior officer. Show me your trident, he demanded desperately, grasping for any way to prove this was all some elaborate joke. Sarah shook her head. My insignia are classified. I don't wear them when I'm not on duty, and I'm certainly not going to flash them around a civilian bar just to satisfy your curiosity. Then how do I know you're telling the truth? You could call Naval Special Warfare Command and ask them, Sarah suggested. I'm sure they'd be very interested to hear about tonight's incident. Davidson's knees almost buckled. The idea of his commanding officers finding out that he had physically grabbed a Navy SEAL was terrifying. His career would be over. He would face court-martial. He might even face criminal charges, ma'am, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't know. I mean, I never would have. If I had known who you were. So it's only wrong to grab women if they're military officers? Sarah asked. It's perfectly acceptable to harass civilian women? Davidson realized he was digging himself deeper with every word. No, ma'am. That's not what I meant. I never should have. You never should have what, Lieutenant? Davidson swallowed hard. I never should have touched you without permission, ma'am. I never should have refused to leave you alone when you asked. I never should have spoken to you the way I did, and I never should have assumed I knew your background based on your appearance. Sarah nodded slowly. That's a start. The atmosphere in Murphy's bar had completely transformed. What had started as a simple confrontation between a drunk officer and a civilian woman had become something much more significant. Lieutenant Davidson stood before Sarah like a defendant awaiting sentencing, while his two subordinates maintained rigid attention despite being off duty. Sarah picked up her military ID and returned it to her wallet. The simple action seemed to emphasize just how casually she carried the credentials that Davidson would have killed for. He had spent years trying to get accepted into special operations training and had been rejected twice. Now he was face to face with someone who had not only been accepted, but had actually completed the most grueling military training in the world. "Ma'am," Davidson said, his voice shaking slightly. "What happens now?" Sarah considered the question carefully. She could report Davidson's behavior to his commanding officer. She could file formal charges for assault. She could make one phone call and end his military career before midnight. The power she held over him was absolute, and they both knew it. "That depends," Sarah said finally. "What do you think should happen?" Davidson's mind raced. He was being given a chance to determine his own fate, but he had no idea what the right answer might be. Everything he had thought he knew about military hierarchy, about women in combat, about his own abilities, had been turned upside down in the space of 30 minutes. "I think I should apologize," he said carefully, "to you and to everyone in this bar." "Go ahead." Davidson turned to face the room. Every eye was on him, and he could see the mixture of curiosity and judgment in their faces. These were the townspeople he had dismissed as boring and insignificant just an hour ago. Now they were witnesses to his complete humiliation. "I apologize to everyone here for my behavior tonight," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet bar. "I was disrespectful, inappropriate, and completely out of line. There's no excuse for how I acted." He turned back to Sarah. "Ma'am, I specifically apologize for grabbing you, for refusing to respect your clear request to be left alone, and for making assumptions about your background and capabilities. My behavior was unbecoming of an officer and completely unacceptable." Sarah nodded acknowledgement but didn't speak. The silence stretched out uncomfortably as Davidson waited for some indication of whether his apology was sufficient. "Tell me something, Lieutenant," Sarah said eventually. "Why did you grab me?" The question caught Davidson off guard. I was angry that you were ignoring me." "Why were you angry about that?" Davidson struggled to find an answer. "I guess I felt like you should have shown me respect because of my rank. Even though you were out of uniform, off duty, and I was a civilian as far as you knew." "Yes, ma'am. Why?" Davidson was quiet for a long moment, clearly thinking hard about his answer. "Because I'm used to people doing what I tell them to do," he admitted finally. "At the base, when I give an order, people follow it immediately. I guess I expected the same thing here. And when you didn't get that automatic obedience, you decided to use physical force?" "I didn't think of it as force," Davidson said quietly. "I just wanted to get your attention. By grabbing my arm without permission?" "Yes, ma'am." Sarah studied Davidson's face carefully. She had seen this type of behavior before in military men, who had spent too long in positions of authority without proper checks on their power. They began to believe that their rank gave them rights over other people that extended far beyond their actual duties. "Lieutenant, how do you think your behavior tonight reflects on the United States Navy?" Davidson winced. "Very poorly, ma'am. How do you think it reflects on the officers under your command?" "It sets a terrible example, ma'am." "How do you think it reflects on the naval base where you work?" "It makes us look like bullies and harassers, ma'am." Sarah was beginning to see genuine understanding in Davidson's eyes. The shock of learning her identity had broken through his arrogance and forced him to actually think about his actions rather than simply defending them. "What would you do if one of your sailors behaved the way you behaved tonight?" Sarah asked. "I would write them up for conduct unbecoming," Davidson answered immediately. "Probably recommend them for disciplinary action." "And if they grabbed a woman in a bar after she asked them to leave her alone?" "I would recommend court-martial proceedings, ma'am." "I see." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "So you hold your subordinates to a higher standard than you hold yourself?" Davidson's shoulders sagged. "I never thought about it that way, ma'am. But yes, that's exactly what I've been doing." Petty Officer Martinez and Seaman Rodriguez were watching this exchange with fascination and horror. They had never seen their commanding officer so thoroughly deconstructed. Davidson had always projected an image of absolute confidence and superiority. Seeing him forced to confront his own hypocrisy was both educational and deeply uncomfortable. "Ma'am," Martinez spoke up hesitantly, "if I may ask, what was your training like? I mean, going through the SEAL program as a woman must have been incredibly difficult." Sarah smiled slightly. It was the first genuine smile she had shown all evening. "It was the hardest thing I've ever done," she said. "Not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. There were times when I wanted to quit every single day." "What kept you going?" Rodriguez asked. "Knowing that if I quit, it would be used as evidence that women couldn't handle the training," Sarah replied. I wasn't just representing myself. I was representing every woman who might want to try after me. Davidson listened to this exchange with growing shame. While Sarah had been pushing herself to superhuman limits to prove that women belonged in special operations, he had been using his position to harass women in bars. The contrast was stark and humbling. "Ma'am," Davidson said suddenly, "could you tell me about the training? I've always wondered what it was really like." Sarah looked at him with surprise. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I tried twice to get into special operations training and was rejected both times," Davidson admitted. "I always told myself it was because of politics or bad timing, but now I'm wondering if maybe I wasn't ready for it." "What made you think you were ready?" Davidson thought about the question seriously. "I was in good physical shape. I had leadership experience. I scored well on all the preliminary tests. And I guess I thought that should be enough." "Physical fitness and test scores get you to the starting line," Sarah said. "They don't get you across the finish line. The real training is about mental toughness, emotional control, and the ability to put the mission and your teammates ahead of your own ego." She looked around the bar, taking in the scene of Davidson's public humiliation. "Based on tonight's performance, how do you think you would have handled the psychological pressure of SEAL training?" Davidson stood in stunned silence as Sarah's question hung in the air. The brutal honesty of it cut through every excuse and rationalization he had built up over the years about his failed attempts to join special operations. Tonight had revealed fundamental character flaws that would have been exposed and exploited mercilessly during SEAL training. "I would have failed," he said quietly, the admission clearly painful. "If I can't handle being told no by a woman in a bar without losing control, I never would have survived the psychological warfare they put candidates through." Sarah nodded approvingly. "Self-awareness is the first step toward improvement." The bartender, who had been quietly listening to the entire exchange, poured Sarah a fresh cup of coffee without being asked. "On the house," he said respectfully, "for your service." "Thank you," Sarah said graciously. She turned back to Davidson, who was still processing the complete demolition of his self-image. "Lieutenant, can I ask you something?" "Yes, ma'am. What kind of leader do you want to be?" Davidson looked confused by the question. "I'm not sure what you mean, ma'am. You have sailors under your command. You're responsible for training them, developing them, and preparing them for whatever challenges they might face. What kind of leader do you want to be for them?" Davidson glanced at Martinez and Rodriguez, who were hanging on every word of the conversation. "I want to be the kind of leader who makes them better," he said slowly. "I want to teach them to be strong, disciplined, and effective. How's that working out so far?" Davidson followed Sarah's gaze to his two subordinates. For the first time, he really looked at them as individuals rather than just extensions of his authority. Martinez looked uncomfortable and embarrassed by his commanding officer's behavior. Rodriguez seemed disillusioned and disappointed. "Not very well," Davidson admitted. "What do you think they learned from watching you tonight?" Davidson felt sick as he considered the question. "They learned that I think my rank gives me the right to harass civilians. They learned that I can't handle rejection. They learned that I make assumptions about people based on their appearance. They learned that I'm a hypocrite who holds others to standards I don't meet myself. And what do you think that teaches them about how they should behave? It teaches them that if you have enough authority, you can treat people however you want," Davidson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It teaches them that the values we claim to represent don't actually matter when it's inconvenient." Sarah could see that Davidson was genuinely grappling with the implications of his behavior. The shock of learning her identity had cracked open his defensive facade and forced him to confront some uncomfortable truths about himself. "Ma'am," Martinez spoke up hesitantly, "if you don't mind me asking, how did you develop such strong leadership skills? I mean, to make it through SEAL training and then handle a situation like this so professionally." Sarah considered the question carefully. "I had excellent instructors who taught me that true strength comes from self-control, not from dominating others. I learned that real leadership means setting an example that others want to follow, not demanding obedience through fear or intimidation." She looked directly at Davidson. "I also learned that the most important battles are often the ones you choose not to fight. Tonight could have gone very differently if I had decided to escalate things instead of trying to de-escalate them." "You mean you could have hurt me worse than you did?" Davidson asked. "I mean I could have destroyed you completely without laying a finger on you," Sarah replied matter-of-factly. One phone call to your commanding officer about tonight's incident would have ended your career permanently. Instead, I chose to turn this into a learning opportunity. Davidson felt a cold chill run down his spine as he realized just how much restraint Sarah had shown. She could have ruined his life with minimal effort, but instead she had chosen to try to help him understand his mistakes. Why? He asked. Why give me a chance to learn instead of just destroying me? Because I've seen what happens when good people make bad choices, Sarah said. Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is show them a mirror so they can see themselves clearly. Destroying someone teaches them nothing except to hate you. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. That's a much more effective approach than just punishing people. Punishment has its place, Sarah said. But development is usually more valuable than destruction. The question is whether Lieutenant Davidson is capable of learning from this experience. All eyes turned to Davidson, who was clearly struggling with emotions he wasn't used to experiencing. His entire adult life had been built around projecting strength and authority. Being forced to examine his weaknesses and failures in front of his subordinates was profoundly humbling. "Ma'am," he said finally, "I want to learn. I want to be better, but I don't know how to change patterns that I've been following for years." "Start with small things," Sarah suggested. "Next time someone tells you no, listen to them. Next time you feel angry about not getting your way, ask yourself why you think you deserve special treatment. Next time you're tempted to use your authority to intimidate someone, remember how it felt to be on the receiving end of superior force tonight." Davidson nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am. I can do that. Can you?" Sarah asked pointedly. "Because changing ingrained behaviors is harder than most people think. It requires constant self-monitoring and a willingness to admit when you've made mistakes." "I understand, ma'am." Sarah studied Davidson's face for signs of genuine commitment versus empty promises. She had seen too many officers who made impressive speeches about change but reverted to their old patterns as soon as the pressure was off. "Prove it," she said simply. "Ma'am, prove that you're serious about changing. Show me that tonight meant something more than just getting caught and having to apologize." Davidson looked confused. "How can I prove that to you, ma'am?" Sarah smiled slightly. "I'll be in town for the next few days for my father's funeral. Ask around at the base, people will know how to reach me. If you're serious about becoming a better leader, then do something that demonstrates it. Don't just tell me you've changed. Show me." The challenge hung in the air as Davidson realized that his real test was just beginning. Apologizing for his behavior had been the easy part. Actually changing his behavior would be much more difficult. "I will, ma'am," he said with quiet determination. "I promise you that I will." 3 days later, Sarah sat in the front pew of St. Mary's Chapel, watching as military honor guards folded the American flag that had covered her father's casket. The funeral had been everything her father would have wanted: respectful, dignified, and attended by dozens of Marines who had served with him over the years. As the ceremony concluded and people began to file out of the chapel, Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see an older Navy captain in dress uniform, his chest decorated with ribbons that spoke of a long and distinguished career. "Lieutenant Commander Chen?" the captain asked quietly. "Yes, sir." "Captain Robert Hayes, commanding officer of Naval Station Millbrook. Could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Sarah nodded and followed Captain Hayes to a quiet corner of the chapel. She had been expecting this conversation ever since the incident at Murphy's Bar 3 nights ago. "I understand there was an incident involving one of my officers," Captain Hayes said without preamble. "Yes, sir. Lieutenant Davidson. He came to my office yesterday morning and requested a meeting. What he told me was quite disturbing." Sarah waited for Captain Hayes to continue, unsure whether Davidson had told the truth about what happened or had tried to spin the story to protect himself. Lieutenant Davidson confessed to inappropriate conduct toward a civilian in a local bar, Captain Hayes continued. He said he had physically grabbed a woman after she repeatedly asked him to leave her alone, and that he had made assumptions about her background that proved to be embarrassingly wrong. "That's an accurate summary, sir." He also said that you showed remarkable restraint in how you handled the situation, and that you turned what could have been a career-ending incident into a learning opportunity for him. Sarah was surprised. She had expected Davidson to minimize his behavior or try to shift blame. The fact that he had voluntarily reported the incident and accurately described his own misconduct was encouraging. "He seemed genuinely remorseful, sir." "He was more than remorseful," Captain Hayes said. "He was completely transformed. In the 3 years I've known Lieutenant Davidson, I've never seen him show the kind of self-reflection and humility he displayed in my office yesterday. What did he say? He said that meeting you had forced him to confront some fundamental flaws in his character and his leadership style. He said he realized that he had been using his authority to intimidate people rather than to serve them. Captain Hayes paused and looked directly at Sarah. He also said that you were one of the most professional military officers he had ever encountered, and that he hoped he could learn to conduct himself with even half of your dignity and self-control. Sarah felt a surprising surge of pride at the compliment. Earning the respect of a fellow officer, even one who had initially behaved so poorly, meant something to her. Sir, if I may ask, what happens to Lieutenant Davidson now? That's partly why I wanted to speak with you, Captain Hayes replied. Normally, an incident like this would result in formal disciplinary action. But Davidson voluntarily reported his own misconduct, took full responsibility for his actions, and specifically requested that he be allowed to make amends rather than simply face punishment. What kind of amends? He asked to be assigned to conduct sensitivity training for all junior officers on appropriate conduct in civilian settings. He also volunteered to write a formal letter of apology to the owner of Murphy's Bar, and to personally apologize to every patron who witnessed the incident. Sarah was impressed despite herself. These were not the actions of someone trying to minimize consequences, but of someone genuinely trying to make things right. There's more, Captain Hayes continued. He specifically asked if there was any way he could demonstrate his commitment to change to you personally. He said you had challenged him to prove that he was serious about becoming a better leader. He did ask me for a chance to prove himself, Sarah confirmed. Well, he's found a way to do that. Are you familiar with the Navy's Big Brother mentorship program? Yes, sir. Senior officers are paired with junior personnel who are struggling with discipline or performance issues. Exactly. Lieutenant Davidson has requested to be assigned as a mentor in that program. He wants to work with sailors who are having the same kinds of problems with authority and respect that he realized he had been having. Sarah was genuinely surprised by this development. Taking on mentorship duties was time-consuming and often thankless work. The fact that Davidson had volunteered for it suggested that his transformation might be genuine. That's a significant commitment, sir. It is, and he specifically asked if you would be willing to observe one of his mentorship sessions to evaluate whether he was applying the lessons he learned from your encounter. Sarah considered this request carefully. She would be leaving Millbrook soon to return to her classified assignment, but the idea of seeing whether Davidson had really changed was intriguing. I would be willing to do that, sir. Excellent. As it happens, he's scheduled to meet with his first mentee this afternoon. A young sailor named Petty Officer Second Class Johnson, who has been having problems with inappropriate behavior toward female personnel. The irony was not lost on Sarah. Davidson would be counseling someone with the same issues. He had recently displayed himself. Where is this meeting taking place? Conference Room B at the base administrative building. 1400 hours. Sarah checked her watch. It was currently noon, which gave her time to grab lunch and prepare for what promised to be an interesting observation session. I'll be there, sir. Thank you, Lieutenant Commander, and may I say your father would have been very proud of how you handled this situation. It takes real strength to show mercy when you have the power to destroy someone. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat at the mention of her father. He taught me that the measure of a person isn't how they use their power over others, but how they choose to lift others up. Wise man, Captain Hayes said with a smile. And clearly a good teacher. As Captain Hayes walked away, Sarah reflected on the unexpected turn of events. When she had walked into Murphy's Bar 3 days ago, she had just been a grieving daughter looking for a quiet cup of coffee. Now she found herself in the position of evaluating whether a fellow officer could learn from his mistakes and become a better leader. The afternoon session would reveal whether Lieutenant Davidson's transformation was genuine or just a performance designed to save his career. Sarah hoped for his sake, and for the sake of the sailors under his command, that it was the former. She thought about her father, who had spent 30 years in the Marines teaching young people how to be better soldiers and better human beings. Perhaps this was her chance to honor his memory by helping another officer learn the same lessons about leadership and character that her father had taught her. At 1400 hours, She would find out whether Lieutenant Davidson was truly ready to become the kind of leader his sailors deserved. At exactly 1400 hours, Sarah positioned herself in the observation room adjacent to Conference Room B. Through the one-way glass, she could see Lieutenant Davidson sitting across from a young sailor who looked barely old enough to shave. This had to be Petty Officer Second Class Johnson. Johnson appeared defensive and angry, his arms crossed and his jaw set in a stubborn line. Sarah had seen that expression countless times during her own leadership experience. It was the look of someone who felt unfairly singled out and was preparing to fight every word of criticism. Davidson, by contrast, looked completely different from the arrogant officer Sarah had encountered 3 nights ago. His posture was open and non-threatening, his expression patient rather than commanding. He had a folder in front of him, but he wasn't hiding behind it or using it as a prop to assert authority. "Johnson," Davidson began, his voice calm and respectful, "thank you for agreeing to meet with me today. I know this isn't how you wanted to spend your afternoon." Johnson shrugged. "Didn't really have a choice, did I, sir?" "Actually, you did," Davidson replied, surprising both Johnson and Sarah. "The Big Brother program is voluntary. You could have chosen formal disciplinary action instead." "Yeah, well, seemed like the better option." Davidson nodded. "Fair enough. Before we start, I want to tell you something about why I volunteered for this program." Johnson looked skeptical but didn't interrupt. 3 days ago, I made some serious mistakes in my personal conduct. I behaved inappropriately toward a woman in a civilian setting, and it forced me to take a hard look at some problems I didn't even realize I had. Sarah was impressed by Davidson's openness. Many officers would have tried to maintain their image of perfection, rather than admitting their own failures to a subordinate. "What kind of mistakes?" Johnson asked, his curiosity overcoming his defensiveness. "I grabbed a woman's arm after she had repeatedly asked me to leave her alone. I used my position as a military officer to try to intimidate her. I made assumptions about what she was capable of based on her appearance." Johnson's eyebrows raised. "What happened?" "She turned out to be a Navy SEAL who could have ended my career with one phone call. Instead, she chose to teach me some very important lessons about respect, self-control, and what real leadership looks like." Davidson leaned forward slightly. "Johnson, I'm not here to lecture you or to pretend I'm better than you. I'm here because I recognize that you're struggling with some of the same issues I was struggling with, and maybe we can figure this out together." Sarah watched Johnson's body language change subtly. His arms uncrossed and some of the tension left his shoulders. Davidson's approach was working. "The report says you made inappropriate comments to some female sailors in your unit," Davidson continued. "Can you tell me about that?" Johnson shifted uncomfortably. "It wasn't that bad. I was just joking around. These women are so sensitive. They can't take a little harmless teasing." Davidson nodded thoughtfully. "I understand. Can I ask you something? How do you think those women felt when you were joking around with them?" "I don't know. Probably fine. Have you asked them?" Johnson looked confused. "Ask them what?" "Ask them how your comments made them feel. Ask them if they thought your jokes were funny. Why would I do that?" Davidson smiled slightly. "Because if you're making jokes that the other person doesn't find funny, then you're not really joking. You're just making them uncomfortable and calling it humor." Sarah could see the wheels turning in Johnson's head as he processed this concept. It was clear that no one had ever explained it to him in those terms before. "I never thought about it that way," Johnson admitted. "Neither did I until recently," Davidson said. "Here's what I learned. When someone tells you that your behavior is making them uncomfortable, you have 2 choices. You can listen to them and change your behavior, or you can ignore them and keep doing what you want. Which choice sounds more respectful to you?" "The first one, I guess." "Right. And which choice sounds like something a professional military serviceman would make?" "Definitely the first one." Davidson opened his folder and pulled out a sheet of paper. "I want to try an exercise with you. I'm going to read you some comments that were made by male sailors to female sailors, and I want you to tell me how you think the women felt when they heard them." Over the next 30 minutes, Sarah watched Davidson skillfully guide Johnson through a series of scenarios and discussions that helped the young sailor understand the impact of his behavior from the perspective of others. Davidson never talked down to Johnson or made him feel stupid. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions that led Johnson to reach his own conclusions. You know, Johnson said at one point, I think maybe I've been acting like a jerk without realizing it. We all do that sometimes, Davidson replied. The important thing is what we do once we realize it. So what should I do now? Davidson considered the question carefully. What do you think you should do? Johnson was quiet for a moment. I should probably apologize to the women in my unit. And I should make sure I think before I speak from now on. Those sound like good starts. Is there anything else? Maybe I should ask someone I trust to tell me if I'm being inappropriate again? Sometimes it's hard to see your own blind spots. Sarah was amazed by the transformation she was witnessing. In just one session, Davidson had helped Johnson move from defensive denial to genuine self-reflection and a concrete plan for change. Johnson, Davidson said as the session neared its end, I want you to know that I have confidence in your ability to make these changes. The fact that you're willing to acknowledge your mistakes and work on them tells me that you have the character to be a great sailor. Johnson straightened up slightly at the compliment. Thank you, sir. And sir, thanks for not making me feel like garbage about this. I was expecting to get yelled at and written up. You might still get written up if you don't follow through on your commitments, Davidson said with a slight smile, but I believe you will. After Johnson left, Davidson sat alone in the conference room for a few minutes, clearly processing the session. Sarah knocked on the door and entered. That was impressive, she said simply. Davidson stood and came to attention. Ma'am, I didn't know you were observing. Captain Hayes arranged it. You asked for a chance to prove that you had learned from our encounter. I'd say you've done that. Davidson relaxed slightly. Thank you, ma'am. Johnson is a good kid who just needed someone to help him understand how his actions affect others, kind of like I did. Sarah studied Davidson's face. The arrogance and entitlement that had characterized their first meeting were completely gone. In their place was a humility and genuine concern for others that transformed his entire presence. What will you do differently going forward? Sarah asked. Everything, Davidson replied without hesitation. The way I talk to my subordinates, the way I make decisions, the way I treat civilians when I'm off duty. I realize that leadership isn't about getting people to do what you want. It's about helping them become the best versions of themselves. Sarah nodded approvingly. Your father would be proud of what you've accomplished here. Davidson looked confused. My father, ma'am? Every good leader has someone who taught them the fundamentals. Someone who showed them what real strength and character look like. Tonight you showed Johnson what good leadership looks like. That means someone showed you first. You did, ma'am. 3 nights ago in Murphy's Bar. Sarah smiled. I may have provided the catalyst, but the change came from within you. That's what makes it real. As Sarah prepared to leave Millbrook and return to her classified duties, she reflected on the unexpected lessons of the past few days. She had come home to bury her father and honor his memory. Instead, she had found herself passing on the leadership principles he had taught her to another officer who needed them. Lieutenant Davidson had learned that true strength comes from self-control and service to others. Petty Officer Johnson had learned that respect is earned through consideration and empathy. And Sarah had learned that sometimes the best way to honor a fallen mentor is to become a mentor yourself. Her father had always said that the greatest victory wasn't defeating an enemy, but turning an enemy into an ally. In helping Davidson transform from a problem into a solution, Sarah had achieved exactly that kind of victory. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of leadership her father would have been proud of.